If you've ever walked into a fly shop or any sporting goods store looking to get outfitted for fly fishing, you probably felt like you were swimming in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with no land in sight. The amount of gear that you can buy is overwhelming. And that brings up a simple question. What gear do you actually need to get started in fly fishing? On today's show, I'll walk you through a list of all the gear you need to get started and why this list is the best place to start. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. A few weeks ago here on the show, I talked all about the flies that I carry in my fly boxes. I showed y'all exactly what's in them. I spilled all the secrets. Well, not that there were any secrets to spill, but it was fun to show you guys exactly what I use and not just talk in general terms anymore. Well, I want to do that same thing, but with all the rest of the gear that you need for fly fishing. We're going to walk through all the gear, every piece of it that you need to get started fly fishing. I'm going to tell you what I use and why this stuff is what I recommend for beginners. So we're going to start at the very beginning with our fly rod, our reel, and our fly line. I know it's kind of obvious, but you do need these things if you want to get out and go fly fishing. Now, what I recommend for a beginner, and the rod that I fish with most of the time, is a 9-foot 5-weight. Now, if you are not trout fishing, I know there's a sizable contingent of folks who either don't live where trout are close by, or they like to fish for a lot of different species, or maybe you're going all panfish. Maybe you got some catfish. Maybe you got some bass. Maybe you got some carp. Maybe you even got pike and muskie readily available. The 9-foot 5-weight might not be the ideal rod for you. In the case that you are only ever going to fish bass, catfish, carp, maybe some pike, maybe a 6-weight would probably be what I would recommend for you. And then on the opposite end of that spectrum, if you are going just panfish, smaller fish, maybe you don't live where the trout get more than 12 inches long, then a 4-weight would probably be really good. Those are a little bit more specialized rods, and I'll dive into the weights in a minute, so just bear with me. I want to set the stage for you. But the reason I recommend the 9-foot 5-weight is the 9-foot 5-weight can handle some bass fishing. It can do panfish just fine. Okay, the 5-weights, it's undergunned for carp. I'm not gonna lie. I wouldn't take a 5-weight out for carp if that's what makes you happy, if that's the fishing that you're doing. I don't know that I would take the 5-weight out for largemouth either. I've got plenty of smallmouth on a 5-weight. A 5-weight's what I take with me down to Lake Powell when I go down there and fish, and I've caught oodles and oodles of smallmouth on that 5-weight. Shoot, I even caught a walleye on that 5-weight. Not that I was trying for it, but it happened. So your 5-weight I would fish everything down to a size 4 streamer with it, all the way down to like a size 26 dry fly, real small stuff. So the possibilities with the 5-weight, you can just cover a really wide gamut of the fly sizes that are available with that 5-weight. That's why the majority of rods that are sold are 5-weights. And again, they're very good for trout fishing, but they can do a few other things as well. So, and knowing that most of the rods sold, something like 70% of the fly rods sold in the U.S. are 5-weights. So I know a lot of this is going to trout fishing. So we're going to focus on that. But I did want to speak to our panfish and our bass guys as well. But your 9-foot 5-weight, that is where I recommend you start. Now, let's talk about line weights for a minute, because I tell you, okay, you want a 9-foot 5-weight. Well, 9 foot, that's how long the rod is. What the heck does 5-weight mean? Well, lines are, I'm going to trip over this more times than I care to admit. Fly rods are rated. I did it. Fly rods are rated for a certain weight of fly line, okay? So if your fly rod says it needs 5-weight fly line, that means it's a 5-weight rod. And all the weight means is your line weights range from about a 0 up to 14. There are some saltwater rods that go all the way to 16. 0 is the lightest. 14 is going to be your heaviest. 5 is almost smack in the middle of those available line weights. That's why it's such a good all-purpose line weight. But as the line weight increases, the line actually weighs a little bit more. Okay, we're not talking about breaking strength here. We're talking about how much the line actually weighs. And the heavier lines can cast bigger flies and catch bigger fish. So that's what happens when we go up in line weights. A 6 weight is going to cast a bigger fly and catch bigger fish than a 5. A 7 weight's going to do much more than a 5. 8 weights, that's where you start getting into some saltwater territory. So that's why the 5, again, I recommend the 5 so stinking much. Now, not just any 9'5" weight's going to do for you, because there's about a bajillion of them, and it's harder to pick one of those than it is to pick a good sauce combo at Buffalo Wild Wings, which I'm just going to go ahead and say right now, Buffalo Wild Wings, their wing sauce is terrible. And I'm sure I'm going to get some stuff for that, but it ain't good. But anyways, I recommend for beginners to buy themselves a medium fast action rod. Now, rod action, you're going to hear a bunch of stuff about this as well once you start diving into the gear. All action means is it's referring to how much of the fly rod bends when you cast it. So a fast action rod, about the top, just the tip section of that rod is going to bend. A medium fast rod, the top third to the top half of the rod will bend. And then a slow action rod, all the way from the tip down to the cork, that rod's going to bend. Those slow rods, they're great for delicate presentations when you've got to land tiny, tiny flies and make it just kiss the water. And then those fast rods are great for big flies and fighting the wind. And then again, we come down to what's right in the middle. Well, that medium fast rod, it's got some delicacy for the small stuff, but it's still got enough backbone to fight through the wind and throw bigger flies. So just like how our 5 weight was a good line weight, the medium fast action rod is just the perfect action for a beginner. It's going to suit you very well as you learn and progress in this sport. Now, let's get down to the reels, because you can spend, oh my goodness, I honestly cannot believe how much reels go for these days. There's some reels that are topping $1,000. And I get it if you're chasing marlin or sailfish or bluefin tuna or mako sharks. Yeah, you want a good reel at that point. But for the majority of trout fishing, all a reel is, it's just a fancy line holder. And I've said that before, and I'll stand behind it, because the amount of times that you hook into a trout that's so big that you have to use the reel to land it, that you can't land it any other way, that's just not as common unless, I guess, you're fishing some fancy place with giant 20-plus inch fish all the time, okay? A good reel is certainly helpful. I'm never going to knock a good reel, but you do not need a $600-700 reel when the vast majority of the time it's just holding your fly line. Okay, the reel that you need as a beginner, focus on getting something that's not too heavy and that has a disc drag. Those are your 2 features that you need to get. There are 2 types of drags in reels, which is how much tension is the line being put under as it's pulled off of the spool. And both drags are going to serve to slow a fish down when they run. A disc drag is adjustable, so you can go from really light drag to really heavy drag, and it is a lot stronger. Now, the click pawl, or you might hear it called too, is a click check reel. It's often not adjustable, or if they are, it's a very small adjustment range, and they don't offer as much resistance. So those reels can be good if you're only ever getting into small fish, but I would just go for something that's not too heavy. Look for a reel that's around 5 ounces, because once you put your line, your backing on there, and you've strung your rod up, that reel that's about 5 ounces is going to balance out your rod well. You're going to have a rig in your hand that feels well, that's not too heavy, doesn't feel like a club that you're swinging around all day like some Neanderthal, right? It's going to feel nice and comfortable in your hands. So that a reel around 5 ounces with a disc drag, that is going to be just about all you need. Now, fly line. We talked about you got to get the right weight. Okay, you're buying a 5-weight rod, so you're going to buy 5-weight fly line. You need to buy weight forward fly line. Now, there are tons of different fly lines out there. We've got double tapers, we've got triangle tapers, and we could talk about head lengths and grain weights and true to weight lines and half weight heavy lines, and we can get into all that. but you don't need to know it. You don't need to understand it to be for beginner fly fishing. The only thing that really matters is you got a weight forward, 5-weight fly line. Okay. Match the weight of the line to what's on your rod. If you're interested in learning more about all the lines, we've done podcasts on those. I'll link to some of those in the show notes so you can learn more about fly lines. But for now, just buy your weight forward and you will be set. Now, one last thing on fly rods before we move on. Most of my fly fishing career has been spent reviewing gear. That's what I did a lot before I joined Ventures, and I still review gear, even now that I'm working for Ventures. And I'm always fishing different rods. I get the opportunity to play with a ton of different sticks. It's a lot of fun. But when I'm out there fishing, and it's not me and Alex making a video, and I'm not reviewing a rod, I'm just going out for a day and enjoying myself. The rod that I reach for is a medium fast. Almost always it's a 9-foot 5-weight. One of my buddies was telling me the other day that he thinks I've got more 9-foot 5-weights than I do friends. And he might not be wrong on that one. So just goes to show that's what I use. I use a medium fast 9-foot 5-weight. I like them. They're great rods. And the fly flinger that we sell here at VFC, it's a medium fast 9-foot 5-weight. It's a good stinking rod. It is a fantastic little stick, and it looks fancier than a dude wearing a mullet and a tuxedo t-shirt. And if there's one thing we know about fly fishing, it doesn't matter if you catch fish. Okay, what matters is that you look cool while you're out there fishing. Okay, and the fly flinger is going to make you look real cool. No, our fly flinger, I reviewed a lot of beginner rods. I'd put the fly flinger up there with any of them. I like it. It's really solid. Alex uses it all the time. Every time we go fishing, he pulls it out and he goes, hashtag fly flinger for life. And he really is that way, though. He loves that rod, plays with it all the time. He catches tons of fish on it, too. It really is a good beginner rod. I'll throw a link to that in the show notes as well, just in case you are curious about looking at one. Okay, we've got our rod, we've got our reel, we've got our line. Well, now we need our flies. Again, another duh. And fly boxes, okay? As far as flies go, well, that's what Ventures Fly Co. does best, right? Well, we do our flies. We know our flies. I would recommend that you go check out our fly collections to get a good assortment of flies. It's going to work anywhere for you, no matter what you're fishing. I'll throw a link to that in the show notes as well. I've done a couple of recent podcasts going into fly types, and it's hard for me to sit here and tell you, well, you need this, 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 and this, because it differs so much depending on where you live and what you're fishing and how you like to fish. So that's why I'd say go look at the fly collections and pick stuff that reflects what you're going to do and the fish that you're going to be catching. Now, as far as the boxes to put those flies in once you've got them, this is another area where I legitimately am flummoxed at how expensive some of these fly boxes are. Blows my mind how much people want for these days. You can spend tons of money. You don't need to. All right, I think I've got 4 of the original tacky boxes from before Fish Pond bought them out. And I think I paid $30 for them at the time, whatever retail was. They weren't too expensive. And I've used those for however long tacky's been around, basically at this point. And they've lasted me great. I have zero reason to rig up with a new set of boxes. So I would say go buy something that's good. Don't go for the super cheap stuff, because you do not want to get that super cheap little plastic box that, you know, maybe you're fishing, it's winter, it's 30 degrees outside, and the plastic gets brittle. You go to open it, and it cracks, and the box spills out of your hands, and all your flies fall in the water, and they go downstream, and you literally watch money be flushed down the toilet. Not that that's ever happened to me. Yeah, it did. It happened to me. That was a rough day of fishing in Colorado. Come to think of it, that bad memory might be why I don't fish in Colorado much anymore. But you don't go super cheap on the boxes. Get something that's durable, that'll last, so you're not constantly replacing them. The one that we have here at VFC, it's a foam insert, so the flies sit in foam, but it's a nice, hard, durable plastic over the top of it. I've been using that for a bit for all my parachute flies, and it's a fantastic little box. I'll throw a link down there for y'all as well if you're interested. Now, the next thing you're going to need is you're going to need tippet and leader to go out and fish. You can't go and fly fishing without tippet and leader. It's like watching football without wings. What are you doing? Yeah, you might as well just watch Oprah and drink a Diet Pepsi. Crazy stuff. So tippet and leader. Let's talk about what those are real quick. Leader is the long tapered piece of fishing line that attaches to the end of your fly line, and then you attach your fly to the other end of it. Your tippet exists to either rebuild your leader, because if you cut a fly off and put a new one on, you're going to be constantly chopping away at that leader, so you can use some tippet to restore the length of that. Or your tippet is used to build multi-fly rigs if you're fishing a dry dropper or a double nymph rig, for example. So that's what you need. Now, what I recommend, and I've talked about this before a bunch on the podcast, if this isn't your first time at Untangled, then you've heard me say, I rarely use anything below 4X for tippet and leaders for the vast majority of my fly fishing. And let me explain those sizes real quick. It's a little confusing. A 4X leader is bigger than a 5X leader. A 6X leader is a lot smaller than a 4X leader. Okay, the bigger the number goes, the smaller the tippet actually is. So 2X leader is bigger than 4X leader. Okay, so that's the leader size. That goes for tippet as well. Leader and tippet are sized the same way. So if you're fishing for trout, you're going to want some 5X though, because there are times when you need a smaller tippet for a bit more delicate presentation. And I always have one spool of 6X with me. I think I've had the same spool of 6X for 2 or 3 years now, because I just rarely use it. If I get into a situation where the water's really low and clear, or the fish are extremely picky about the micro drag, then I bust out the 6X. But there's very rarely a need for 6X tippet just like that. 5X is what you're going to want to go with. Now, for the leader, you're going to see there's a whole bunch of different leader lengths out there when you walk in to buy it. The rule of thumb is that you want to match the length of your leader to the length of your rod. So we've got you set up with a 9-foot rod right now. So go buy some 9-foot leaders. I'd get a 9-foot 3X, 4X, and 5X leader. That's going to cover you for streamers, nymphs, dries. You're going to be set with those leaders. And I would get spools of 3, 4, and 5X tippet in your bag as well. Now, you will notice when you go to buy these leaders and tippet that there's 2 different materials. You're going to have nylon and you're going to have fluorocarbon. Okay, the difference between the two, nylon, it floats and it stretches before it breaks. So it's got a little give to it before it snaps. Fluorocarbon, it sinks. It's mostly invisible in the water. It's a bit more brittle though, so it will snap instead of stretch, but it does have higher knot strength than nylon. The rule of thumb here is that if you want your flies to sink, so if you're fishing nymphs or whatnot, you're going to grab fluorocarbon. And if you want your flies to float, so you're fishing dry flies, you're going to grab nylon. So you want nylon and fluorocarbon leaders, as well as nylon and fluorocarbon tippet. Now, you've got all that stuff put together. You need some way to trim it all and take care of it out there on the water, right? That's where your nippers and your forceps come into play. You've got to have some way to cut the leader and tippet, just like I said, and to dress flies up. And then the forceps help grip the flies when you're taking them out of a fish's mouth or removing them from your shirt or your ear or your buddy's ear, wherever a fly gets stuck, because they get stuck to everything. That is something you will learn if you get into this fly fishing business. I prefer personally to use a 2-in-1 nipper forcep combo. I've been using the Dr. Slick's mitten scissor clamp for a long time now, longer than I've known my wife. I've been using that. I think they're like $17 or something like that. They're not expensive. That's what I love. And you don't need to go expensive here. There's some nippers you could buy that are like $250. Don't buy them. Don't. That's just, I mean, if you got the money, I guess, but that's just dumb. You don't need $250 nippers. Okay, get something that'll last. The thing with nippers, you're going to lose them. So don't spend a whole lot of money on them. All right. No matter what you do, you're going to lose them. So just take my word on that. Get a decent pair, spend $5, you'll be fine. Now, for your dry flies, to keep them floating, because dry flies don't just stay floating all by themselves. They get wet and they start to sink, and then they're not a dry fly anymore. So you're going to need some floatant to go with that. There are a few different kinds of floatant. You'd think that I talk for a living or something with how well I stumble over words every now and then. Oh, there are a few kinds of floatant out there on the market. What I like and what we sell here at VFC, what goes in our starter packs, is the Loon Aquel. It's a liquid floatant, and you put that on your fly first. You put it on your dry fly before you start fishing. You work it into the hackle really well, work it into the wing if there's a wing on there, and then give it a minute or so to dry, feel really good, and then you'll throw it out there. Now, it doesn't last all day long, so you can either reapply that liquid floatant, you blow your fly off, try and get it as dry as possible, and then put some liquid floatant on there. Or what I prefer to do is I also carry some dry shake. I prefer the Loon Top Ride stuff, and when my fly gets really wet and starts to sink, I stick it in the dry shake, shake it up really good, and then it's good to go again for another 10, 15 minutes, probably, depending on how many fish you catch and what kind of dry fly you're fishing. But regardless of what system you choose, that's just what I use. You do need some kind of floatant, so make sure you've got some of that in your pack. Now, we've got to talk about some of the other stuff here. We're getting into the dark side. The dark side. Split shot and bobbers for nymphing. No, I mean, it's not the dark side. If you're new to Untangled, I like to give nymphing a little bit of a hard time, but I nymph all the time as well. And this might surprise some of you. I got split shot and bobbers in my pack at all times just in case I need it. And you're going to need that as well, because if you're nymphing, which is where you're fishing the flies below the surface, sometimes you got to get them down fairly deep. So you're going to need the split shot to sink them. And then the bobber, the technical term for it's the strike indicator. It suspends your flies at a certain depth, and then it bobs underneath the water when you catch, or when a fish goes and eats one of your flies. I just call it a bobber, but technically it's a strike indicator. You're going to need some of both of those in your pack so you can rig up a nymph rig if the situation calls for it. For split shot, there is a sizable chunk of the fly fishing community that is trying to do away with lead and using lead in water, and for very, very good reasons. I've tried the tin split shot. It's just not as heavy as lead, so you do have to use more of it, but it's great for getting lead out of the water. So that's an option. You can definitely use that stuff. As far as your bobbers go, it really becomes personal preference. What I like, what I've been using for the last few years are the airlock indicators. They don't move up and down on my leader. They just screw into place and they stay there. And the medium-sized ones are the ones that seem perfect for just about everything I do. There are a few other types of indicators. You've got the round ball ones that are made from plastic or foam, like the airlock that I just mentioned. Some of them can be screwed into place like the airlock or the Oros indicators. But the thingamabobber, it's another plastic ball one. It's just threaded through your leader. That means it's really easy to adjust. You just slide it up and down your leader, but it does slide around a lot, though, which is one reason I've quit using thingamabobbers. There are wool indicators that attach with a bit more of a complex system, but they're the lightest and they make the least noise, the least splash on the water. There's also some pinch-on foam indicators for really light nymphing work, but for beginners and for a lot of what you're going to be doing, the airlock indicators are my favorite. That's what I would go with right now. Okay. You've got a pretty sizable amount of stuff right now, don't you? You got split shot and indicators and leaders and nippers and tippet and all sorts of stuff. You got to put it in a pack, don't you? Yeah. Well, this is really, really personal preference. I love a chest pack. That's what I use all the time. If you've watched any of our videos, you've seen it. Alex uses a hip pack. He loves it. And then his dad and brother both use sling packs. So we've got the whole range covered just about here at VFC. We actually sell slings because it seems that that's what most people prefer. That's the majority of what people want is a sling pack. Vests are an option too. I rocked a vest for a long time before I went over to the chest pack. The only thing that I would say is find something that's comfortable, that fits you well, but then make sure that it has a ring to hang your net off of on the back, because it's very convenient to have your net just hanging right on your back. So when you catch a fish, you just reach behind you, pull the net out, net the fish, boom, that's all she wrote. Take a picture, put it on Instagram, become famous, and start rolling in the dough, because that's how that works, right? We put a picture on Instagram, you get famous, and people give you money, isn't it? I thought that's how it worked. Again, personal preference, but that's just what you want. Now, for your net, you do need to make sure that it's got a rubber or silicone basket, because trout and a few other fish species as well, they've got a slime layer on the outside of them, and that slime layer actually protects them from disease. And cloth nets or string nets will strip that slime layer away. It can actually kill the fish. The rubber or silicone ones don't do that. That's why you want to make sure you've got rubber or silicone on your net. Okay, we're just about wrapped up here. We've got waders and boots to talk about next. Waders is another place where I cannot believe the amount of money that's getting spent on waders these days. It's insane. You can spend $1,000 on them right now if you want to. But just like with just about nearly any piece of outdoor gear, you get what you pay for. You're going to pay up for the brand name sometimes, but you're going to get what you pay for. So it's hard for me to make a blanket recommendation on what's good for a beginner. That said, Simms makes a pair of waders called the Tributary waders, and they're about $250. And I think that's, all things considered, the best value on the market. Simms does a great job with their warranty. They can repair waders. They're very, very good at that. And if you're fishing 20-ish days a year, which is actually more than most anglers fish on average, it's really hard to beat the deal that you're going to get out of those Tributary waders, because they'll last for the vast majority of what most fly anglers are doing. Now, personally, I use Squala's Back Eddy or RS waders when I'm out fishing. I use the Back Eddies the most. That's because they're the most comfortable for me, and they've got the durability and some of the features that I need, because I'm out on the water anywhere from 150 to 200 days a year, just with everything that I'm doing between fishing and filming and whatnot. Those waders are around $700, I think, and that's pricey. There ain't no two ways about it. It's expensive, but they're worth it for me because of how much I fish and how much I'm out on the water. They've held up to a lot of abuse. I love them, but for the beginners and casual anglers, $700 is way too much to spend. So that's why I recommend the Simms Tributaries. They're just hard to beat because, again, of their price point and just the durability they're going to offer you. Now, wading boots, I can't recommend anything else other than the new Stealth Sneaker from Corkers. These things, Alex and I have been using them all summer, and oh my goodness, they are so comfortable. They are so light. It's like wearing skate shoes. It brought me back to middle school when I was listening to Blink 182 and thinking I could do a kickflip, and I could never even do a freaking ollie or whatever they call it. But I wore the skate shoes, dadgummit. Oh, they're so comfortable. They've held up to miles and miles of hiking, miles of stream wading. They're just fantastic. You can definitely find some cheaper boots out there, but they're not going to be made to the same quality that you get from Corkers. I think the Stealth Sneaker runs around $150. Corkers also has some of the best customer service in the industry. I love those guys over there. They do great work. You will not be disappointed with them. All right. That's all the gear you need. Now what? Well, we put together a gear checklist. If you want to go and assemble all this and put it all together all on your own, and the link for that gear checklist is going to be in the show notes. But if you're like me, if you're a little lazy sometimes, if you're the type to kick back and relax a little bit instead of doing a whole lot of shopping, then we actually have a solution for that. We sell starter packs here at VFC that get you everything you need in one bundle. You just click buy and it shows up at your doorstep, and there's all sorts of fancy stuff in there. There's our learning resources. There might even be I sure hope my picture's not in there somewhere. I've talked to shipping about that. That would not be good. But we've got all sorts of wonderful stuff that comes along with the starter pack, but it includes everything we talked about here, sands, waders, and boots. It's high quality. It's great stuff. And tons of anglers have used those starter packs to catch their first fish. So I will throw a link for those in the show notes as well, just in case you're interested. And with that, folks, we are ready to move on to the Q&A section of this week's show. So get comfortable and get ready for some great Q&A. Every week, half the show is dedicated to directly answering questions from listeners. Often these questions that y'all send in become the basis for the first half of the show as well, so you never know where your question is going to get answered. If you've got a question about fly fishing that you would like answered, please send them in because Untangled runs on questions. There is a link to do that in the show notes. And our first question this week comes to us. Elliot from Maryland writes in and says, a couple days ago, I went fly fishing for the second time ever. Me and my friend had a blast catching these tiny little pumpkin seeds and getting our lines caught in trees. We saw trout, but no matter what we threw at them, they wanted nothing to do with our lures. They were all bunched up and not very active. I guess my question is, why the heck were they just sitting there doing nothing? My best guess was the heat. If so, what can you do when the trout just aren't biting? Thanks in advance. Hey, Elliot. So thanks for the question. I appreciate it. I'm gonna start off here by addressing a common myth that I see out there in the fly fishing world, and I'm sure some folks are gonna disagree with me here, and that's fine. But the fact is this: it is not possible to catch every single fish. Just isn't. Sometimes the fish just don't want to play, and there's nothing that you can do to change that. End of story. Okay. Now, in this case, Elliot, you mentioned the heat, and I want to draw some attention to that because trout are very temperature-sensitive critters, and if it gets too hot, they're going to act like me after a plate of 3 dozen winks, rudderless in the great sea of life. They can't move. Seriously, though, when water gets too warm, the amount of oxygen in the water drops, and the lower that level drops, the less and less fish move because there's less oxygen for them to breathe. If the water gets too warm, the fish can actually die because there's no oxygen for them to breathe. So the fish that you saw hanging out doing nothing were probably trying to conserve energy and waiting until the water cooled down before they moved around. It is generally a good idea to quit fishing for trout if the water temps get above 68 degrees Fahrenheit. That's when you want to end it. And I know it's not easy to do that. It's tough. Just earlier this summer, one of my local tailwaters, I went down to it, and it was 1st August, I think, and it's not easy to access this part of the river. And I climbed all the way down this big old cliff. I got down there, and the minute I stepped in the water, I knew. I didn't even need a stream thermometer. I knew, yeah, that's not below 68. That's too warm. And so I hiked out. I didn't fish. I left. And I'm not saying that to beat my chest. I'm not saying that to be, oh, look at me. I'm so great. And I'm better than everybody because I don't fish. It's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying I know how tough it is. Personally, I know how much that sucks to walk away. But it was the best thing for the fish. Okay? There's no point to killing the fish just for our enjoyment. That's why we do catch and release. We put them back. We don't want to harm the resource. We got to take care of it. So when it's too hot, just quit fishing. But thank you so much for that question, Elliot. I appreciate it. Johnny from Minnesota has our next question, writes in and says, when should I use a dry dropper? I see all these videos on how to set up a dry dropper, but not when to or how to fish them. I would really appreciate your help. I love the show. Keep up the good work. Oh, thanks, Johnny. I appreciate it. I'm going to answer your question, though, with another question. What's the point of fishing a dry dropper rig? What are you trying to accomplish with that dry dropper rig that you can't accomplish with a single dry fly or a double nymph rig or a streamer? Think on that for a minute. What is the point of fishing a dry dropper rig? Well, you fish a dry dropper to cover the top of the water for any of the fish that are willing to look up and eat off the top. And then your dropper usually falls into that bottom third of the water column. So what you're doing there is covering the two most common areas of the water column where trout are going to eat, and you're accomplishing that with one rig. Whereas those other rigs that I mentioned, you're focusing only on one specific part of the water column. So you would want to fish a dry dropper in water where you feel like there's an equal chance of fish eating off the top and eating your nymphs. Pocket water is a great example of this. A dry dropper run through pocket water is a deadly way to fish. All right. A dry dropper is fantastic on small freestone streams as well, giving trout two different options as your rig goes by them. It can sometimes be tougher to fish a dry dropper on big rivers because those rivers can be so deep that your dropper just never really gets down far enough to be very effective. So if the fish aren't looking up to eat, you're not doing much more than just casting, right? So sometimes it's not the best rig to use. I use the dry dropper almost all the time. Probably 80% of my fishing is the dry dropper rig, but even then, I still switch out when I need to. Well, I'll give you an example. I was out fishing just last week with Alex, and it got to this run. I had a dry dropper rigged up, and I just knew there was a fish there. I knew there was a fish there the way that kids know they can get dad to buy them that Snickers at the hardware store. They just got to push the right buttons, and they're going to get that candy bar, right? Especially when they're with dad. Yeah, you go with mom, she ain't going to get you the candy bar. No, you've had enough sugar today. Now be quiet. Or maybe that was just my mom. I don't know. Anyways, what was I talking about? Oh, yeah, dry dropper stuff. So I got to this run, had a dry dropper on, and I knew there was a fish there, but I could tell my nymph just wasn't getting deep enough. So I cut the dry dropper off. I put a double nymph rig on. First cast through that run, boom, hooked into 18, might have even been 20-inch rainbow. Beautiful fish, just bright red, gorgeous fish. But the point remains, I had to switch the rig up because I wasn't getting quite deep enough. Because again, the whole point of fly fishing is to present a fake bug in a way that makes a fish think that it's the real thing. All these different rigs that we have just give you different options to accomplish that goal. So the dry dropper will accomplish that goal in some situations. Other situations, like I just described, it wasn't cutting it. I had to use a double nymph rig. There is very rarely a right way to do it, though. Okay, you could have fished a really long dry dropper in that situation I just described. I could have done it. Maybe it would have worked. Maybe it wouldn't have. Okay, I don't know. I went to a double nymph rig instead. There's very rarely a right way to do this, though. Okay, the water conditions and the fish behavior are going to tell you which rig is going to be most effective. That's why it's so important to pay attention to what the water's doing, how the fish are acting, what the bugs are doing before you start rigging up and fishing, because all that information will give you everything you need to know about the right rig for that situation. So thanks a bunch for sending that question in. I appreciate it. Steve from Idaho Falls writes in and says, Spencer, I'm in East Idaho and 2 years into fly fishing. Last night, I was on the South Fork of the Snake River. I found a great spot with fish sipping on the surface of BWOs. I threw on a last chance cripple, drifted it downstream to them. Upstream was not possible. I got multiple takes, some large, but I lost all of them. I think the problem was the hook set. I was lifting straight up when they hit, but it was like it was going in deep enough to the fish's mouth to hold them. How on earth do you set downstream on a dry fly? Well, Steve, this is a fantastic question. So when you're fishing down to fish, that is, you are standing above the fish and you're letting the current carry your flies, or maybe you're swinging a fly like a soft tackle or a streamer. Everything that you have learned about good hook sets goes completely out the window. Dom Swentowski over at Trout Bitten, he's one of the best teachers in fly fishing right now. Love the stuff that he's doing. I got to get out on the water with Dom at some point. But he has a wonderful explanation of this exact issue, and he explains why setting the hook straight up like you did isn't the best choice in this situation. I'm going to link to this full article about it in the show notes so y'all can take a look at it. But Dom does such a great job of explaining this concept. I'm just going to read a couple quotes from it right here because he says it better than I can. So Dom says, when swinging flies or any time the fly is downstream of us, our best bet is to sweep the rod toward the near side riverbank. Always set the hook downstream as much as possible, and for swung flies, that is bank side. When fishing nymphs under an indie, if I let the rig drift past my position, I do the same thing. I sweep the rod downstream and toward the bank. This pulls the fly sideways into the trout's mouth. Lifting upstream to the sky is the worst hook set when a fish is downstream of our position. This setting angle takes the fly away from the fish, pulling it out of the trout's mouth. It also puts maximum tension on the tippet at the moment of contact and pulls the fish to the surface. So that's the end of what Dom said there. So what you should have done, Steve, is you should have pulled the rod to either side of you towards whichever riverbank was nearer, and that would have helped you get a much better hook set. You probably would have landed a few of those fish. And if you think about it, when you lift straight up on a hook set, like Dom said, and you're upstream, you're actually taking the fly away from the fish and out of its mouth, because lifting straight up is going to pull your fly, your leader, and your fly line all the way back upstream. So just something to think about. Again, I linked that whole article in the show notes for y'all, and thanks, Steve, for sending that question on in. Sean from Calgary has our next question, writes in and says, I understand the importance of getting the right drift so as to minimize drag and present the fly in the most natural way. However, I've also heard that hoppers and leeches can tail out in a drag at the end of a drift and not spook trout. In other words, while dry flies, emergers, and nymphs should be presented drag-free, is it true that hoppers and leeches can drag at the end of a drift? Sean, this is a good question, and I'm gonna tell you a little story to answer part of it here for you. Years ago, I was out with my buddy Blair, and we were fishing this river. We'd never been to it before, but it's loaded with cutthroat, and we both thought it'd be easy pickings. We were so confident. We rolled up to that river like the big man on campus. Just our crap didn't stink. That's the attitude we had going into that day of fishing. Well, we got there super early in the morning. This is back when I'd actually wake up early for things. And we went to work fishing our guts out all day. And we did not catch a single thing. It was a cutthroat river. In the middle of August, there's hoppers everywhere, and we didn't catch jack squat. So, a few hours before dark, we went back to town. We start asking around. And one guy, bless his heart, he took pity on us, and he drove up to the river with us. And he handed me and Blair, Chubby Chernobyl, each a little hopper pattern. And he said, yeah, slap it on the water and just twitch it. Just twitch it. And he showed us how it was done. He threw it out there, one little twitch, and boom, a fish smacked that thing like I smack a plate of wings. And man, for the rest of the night, it was on. We caught fish till we couldn't see anymore. It was fantastic. So, in a roundabout way, Sean, yes, sometimes you do want movement on your flies. Drag is probably the wrong word for it, though, because what we were doing with that twitch on those hoppers is something that I've learned now. Again, this was years and years ago. I didn't know very much then, but I've learned now that it's actually pretty common to do that twitch when you're fishing hoppers, because if you think about it, hoppers don't just fall in the water and stay there, right? They're not just, oh, well, I guess this is my life now. I'm in the water. No, they're twitching. They're trying to get back to the bank. They want to get back to where they were. So they'll certainly be moving a little bit. By twitching my hopper just slightly that night, like I did, I was imitating that movement and eliciting strikes from the fish. When you talk about leeches, Sean, dragging at the end of a drift, I'm pretty sure what you're referring to is the swing. As the fly swings through the water, that rapid movement can trigger a predatory strike from a fish, because trout love food that's moving away from them, and leeches do make those sudden movements at times, as does, honestly, just about anything you're imitating with a streamer is going to do that. So again, it's less that you're adding drag and more that you're adding lifelike movement to your flies. We do that same thing with soft tackles. You swing them at the end of a drift to imitate an emerger shooting towards the surface. That sudden movement is similar to what real flies do, and fish key in on that. So again, don't think of it as adding drag. Think of it as adding some lifelike movement to your flies, and then certainly play around with it. Experiment, see what happens, and you'll start to dial in some good movements, especially on your local rivers and your local fish. Well, folks, that wraps up the Q&A section of this week's show, but don't go anywhere because we've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. Every week, we dedicate the last portion of the show to sharing a story from our audience. These Live Real Life moments are a way to share your successes, your lessons, or observations from your time on the water. We want to hear your stories, so there's always a link to submit them in the show notes. We love the stories. Send pictures in with it as well, even video. We want to see what y'all are doing out there because that's what we're here for at VFC. We want to help you live real life, have a great time out on the water. And this week's Live Real Life moment comes from, I got to start adding a pronunciation guide to these things. I believe Jarek is what I've got here. So hopefully I got your name correct. Jarek writes in and says, "Hello, Spencer. Here is a large-scale sucker fish I caught in runoff conditions at a local tributary near Missoula, Montana. I fish this river often and have never caught a sucker out of it before, so when I hooked into this monster, I thought it was possibly a trout of a lifetime. When I got it to the net, I was kind of bummed out as I saw it wasn't a trout, but a sucker. But then I immediately started laughing and realizing this is by far the biggest fish I've caught since I just started fly fishing last April in 2023. This thing was a hog. It measured just shy of 22 inches and weighed probably 4 to 5 pounds. I went home that night curious about suckers and researched them online, and I realized it wasn't far off from the state record fish. I'm confident it is probably one of the biggest large-scale suckers caught from that tributary, as that species isn't listed on Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks site for this tributary. Long-nosed suckers are, though. I guess large-scale work their way up to smaller tributaries in the spring to spawn. The state records for suckers are usually caught out of the reservoirs near the Missouri River, which produces massive fish. Anyways, I have a lot more respect for suckers now. I know they are a species that don't get a lot of respect for some reason, and people prefer to have a trout on the end of their line. I was the same way, but this monster changed my mind. This fish put up a heck of a fight, and I thought my 5-weight was going to snap in half. I now look forward to catching more suckers on a fly rod and hope people can see just how underrated these fish can be. Side note, the state record for large-scale fish was broke about 2 weeks ago in Montana by a 12-year-old. Thanks for all you do, and I hope you enjoy this story." Well, Jarek, thanks. That's awesome. I love hearing stories about folks getting into some different fish out on the water because they are a ton of fun to go out and experience those things. I love catching whitefish, for example, and a lot of trout guys don't like catching whiteys. I love them. I love whitefish. They are a ton of fun. I feel the same way about it. The suckers are fun to catch too. They're just an interesting fish, and they're native too, which is really cool. So it's another native fish that we're able to catch. But I love that story. You did a great job telling it, Jarek, and thank you so much for sending that in. And with that, folks, we are going to wrap up this week's episode of Untangled. As always, if you've got a question you would like answered about fly fishing, please send those in. There's a link to submit your questions in the show notes. There's always a link to submit your Live Real Life moments as well. We want your stories. We want to hear from y'all. We want to share in the success that you're having as you're living real life out there on the water. And if you could, please rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more reach we have, and the more people we can help have a fantastic day out on the water. And with that, folks, go out there, have some fun this week, get into some fish, and until next week, tie lines, everybody.